Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. Did his BA there, and then MA and PhD at the New School in New York. And has written a very impressive series of books about, and some of the titles, I'll start with the most recent, on various aspects of populism. Routledge Handbook of Global Populism, 2019, was Populism, A Quick Immersion. That's a rather ominous title, because it does feel as though we are being immersed in populism at the current time. Came out in 2019, 6 years later. Seems as if this promise is coming true. The Promise and Perils of Populism, 2015, Latin American Populism of the 21st Century, going back to the populist seduction in Latin America, 2010. So really a very, very, very comprehensive palette of scholarly works on this topic. Which allow us to hope that you will be bringing us up to speed on the current moment and the current situation. There's lots of room around the front here if you want to do a quick loop. I'm trying to sneak in behind the... Yes, someone else is there. So we hope that you're going to be bringing us up to speed and giving us the most up-to-date take on these very concerning phenomena. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Thank you for making the trip over here. This is the sort of international networking and cross-fertilization of ideas and information that we all need at this current time. So very much appreciated. We're looking forward to hearing you talk about precarious times in the Americas and letting us know, are we looking at radical right populists, are we looking at fascists or fascism, or are we looking at... Thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing you.
Thanks so much for the very kind presentation. Can you hear me well back there? Okay. If I am going too fast, make signs to me. It's Esteban's fault, he gave me too much coffee. And I've been talking very fast. Well, thanks so much for the introduction, thanks so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I want to share with you today is my bewilderment. I don't know, I mean, we are in a very complicated time. I think that we perhaps something new, perhaps something different. So that's what I want to do today, is to compare the first Trump in Bolsonaro from Brazil with the second Trump. So, please. Okay, so the first Trump and Bolsonaro are poster childs of radical right populism. They fit into all of the definitions that we currently have of populism. They fit on the ideational definition, which looks at populism as a series of ideas about politics, and politics is supposed to be a confrontation between an evil elite and the pure people. It also fits into Cole Wayland's strategic notion of populism, in which a charismatic leader appeals to this mostly disorganized followers, or you can use Ernesto Laclau's theory. I don't know if you want me to say Laclau or Laclau. Laclau sounds more in Spanish, Laclau is more French. But so let me use Laclau. Anyways, for Laclau, it's a political logic, and it's a confrontation between two sets of antagonistic camps, which could bring to the rupture of the system. So if you look at any of these definitions of populism, and of course, when you talk about populism, we have been debating what populism is and how to study that since the 1950s, when Gino Germani, an Italian Argentinian sociologist, wrote his first works on populism. And we are not in agreement on what it is or how to study that. So anyways, that's where we are, but both fit very well into that. Please. Okay, these two leaders emerged after cycles of protest. Trump emerged after the the Tea Party protest, which was a protest against Obama. Obama was the first African-American president in the United States. After living for many years in the United States, I never thought I would see an Afro-descendant being the president of the United States. The United States gave you good and bad surprises. That was a very good surprise. Anyways, there was a lot of resistance from the Tea Party against Obama, especially this was an alliance of grassroots organizations, and these grassroots organizations were made up of libertarians, people who believe that the state should not interfere at all in your private life, and they even believe in the legalization of marijuana, with Christian fundamentalists that, of course, will never agree with legalizing marijuana or having all of those freedoms, but they worked together, and they were able to live together in these organizations of the Tea Party. They were also supported by Fox News. Fox News was sort of like, it promoted them and it helped them. And they also had all of the money from the Koch brothers, which are these millionaires who support right-wing causes. And the opposition was against Obamacare. The idea, I mean, the United States, it has been very difficult for poor people to afford healthcare, and Obamacare was a way to help them. Now Trump is trying to get rid of that in the Republicans, but also mortgage relief. I mean, remember that Obama was elected after the crash of this boom that they have in construction in the United States. So the idea was that the state was giving handouts to people who do not produce. American populists always use this discourse of producerism, where you make a distinction between real producers who work hard, save, and pay taxes, and underserving others who live from the welfare that comes from the money that taxpayers pay. And of course, they were also against immigration, and well, but that was the Tea Party, and the Tea Party did not have a leader. It was a series of grassroots organizations, and my argument is that they did not have a leader until Trump came around and he became the leader of the Tea Party. And then in Brazil, you have from 2013 till 2018, a series of mobilizations against the Workers' Party that have been in power for many years. These protests started with a protest against increasing prices of transportation. Transportation in Brazil was of bad quality and it was becoming very expensive, poor quality education, and they were also against all of these massive works that they were trying to promote at the time for the Olympics and the World Cup. But the protests continue. At the beginning, you have these more progressive groups who were fighting against increasing the transportation prices. And you also have groups of people that dressed with the Brazilian colors. They were right-wingers who were totally against the Workers' Party. They were mostly white Brazilians, mostly middle-class Brazilians. So as time went on, most of the demonstrations continued to be these people who dressed with the colors of the Brazilian flag and were anti-Workers' Party, and they lead to the impeachment of Rousseau and Bolsonaro. The dynamic is that after these two presidents got to office, they were able to, they did not have the support of all the economic elites. Second of all, they have a resistance from state functionaries, bureaucrats who believe that they have loyalty to their jobs and not loyalty to a particular politician. And Trump learned from the mistakes of his first administration. And they did not have, also they have a series of oppositions in institutions like the judiciary, the political opposition, and the legislative. But the main opposition came from civil society. When Trump was elected, a week after Trump was in power, or 10 days after he was in power, you have massive demonstrations for women's rights. Then you have demonstrations, the world is becoming crazy. Then you have demonstrations in favor of science. Then you have demonstrations against people bringing weapons to school, etc., etc. And then you have the biggest social movement, the largest social movement in the United States history, with Black Lives Matter. And in Brazil, you also have a series of protests against Bolsonaro for his environmental policies, his genocide of indigenous people, the destruction of the Amazon, and his total neglect of public health with COVID-19, which brought unnecessary deaths in Brazil. And then you have all of these demonstrations saying, Bolsonaro out. The outcomes were, they were not able to bring regime change. You have democratic resilience and polarization increase. What Bolsonaro did was to disrupt, but not being able to finish with all of these policies that Brazil has had for many years in terms of affirmative action, the environment, etc., etc. He disrupted, but he did not eliminate that. What you have with Trump is, first of all, ending with a consensus that linked globalization with limited multicultural recognition. In the United States, you also have an incredible change in the public sphere. In the public sphere, used to be of bad taste and forbidden to use misogynist, racist, homophobic language. All of that was normalized with Trump, and also he took over the Republican Party that transformed into his own personalistic movement, the MAGA movement. So, and then you have January 8th and January 6th and January 8th. I love that photograph of the shaman. Anyways, after those demonstrations, I think that, okay, let's make a distinction there. In Brazil, you have an investigation of the system of justice. They were able to show that Bolsonaro conspired to try to bring a coup d'etat, to try to violently not only to not accept the election that he lost, but also to kill some politicians. So we know what happened in Brazil. And for the first time in Brazilian history, somebody who was plotting a coup d'etat was brought to justice and found guilty, which is fantastic for Latin America, in general for world democracy. We do not know what happened with Trumpism, because with Trumpism, we do not have a real investigation of what happened, because at the beginning, the House of Representatives was able to censor him, the Senate did not allow for that, then the justice system took forever. So we don't know what happened. So this is my query. I don't know whether or not Trump wanted to stop elections because he lost them, or he was playing according to the populist handbook. Because for populist leaders, they are the people. They are the people. So the people can only vote for them because they cannot vote for any other politician that is not the people. So to what extent was Trump following the populist playbook of believing that the people can only vote for him, or he was doing something else? Perhaps he was trying to give a coup d'etat, or he was trying to violently oppose that he lost the election. And it's interesting because, Robert Paxton is a very well-known historian of fascism. He was a professor in Colombia. He's not a Marxist. And these other people from the liberal establishment, and they start to say that Trump is a fascist. And so the debate on whether or not Trump has become a fascist and not a populist any longer started to be present. And you can see from these two quotes of Trump the changes that they are referring to. One is to say, I am your voice, another is to say, I am your retribution. Can you?
Yes. Sorry.
So, to try to make sense of these debates, I went, I did this element. It's very interesting that Cambridge now has these very short books that they call elements. It's like a very long article or a very short book. If any of you want a copy of that, please let me know. I can send it to you. I don't know if your library has access to elements. I believe that they do, but if they don't, please write to me. Okay. So we're talking about two very complicated categories in the social sciences, perhaps the most controversial ones. Despite all of the debates that we have on populism and fascism, there's no agreement on what they are. So what I wanted to do is to first look at their elective affinities and at their differences. And in the book, I start with an epistemological reconstruction of the debates on these concepts, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Let me try to go back to the subject. So populism and fascism share a particular logic of politics, a particular idea of politics, in which politics is an antagonistic struggle between two camps. The logic of the political is the struggle between friend and enemy. Very Schmittian idea of the struggle between friend and enemy. And this is based on Laclau's idea. And the idea is he makes a distinction between the popular subject and the democratic subject. For Laclau, the democratic subject accepts the legitimacy of existing institutions and presents one demand after another to the elite and to the system. They are able to address those demands individually. But sometimes the popular subject is formed where all of these demands cannot be resolved individually, and they create a change of equivalency that could lead to the rupture of the system. So both populism and fascism are ways of understanding politics that could lead to the rupture of existing political systems. It's very different from the logic of liberal democracy. The second is this idea of pars pro toto dynamic. The idea is that a section of the population embodies the real people. For right-wing populism, it's mostly people that have been understood in terms of ethnicity, in terms of culture, in terms of religion. So they are the real people. And the others are the non-people. And for populism, the part that embodies the population or the real people are those who are at the bottom of society, the plebs, those who do not have power, against people that have money, resources, and power. And the third one is this idea of the people as one. Whereas in liberal democracies, you have the idea that you have a population that it's very diverse in terms of their demands, in terms of their ideologies, in terms of their opinions. For populism and fascism, the people is only one, and it's the people according to what the leader considers that the people need or the people demand. So the people is like a homogeneous actor, which of course is a fiction because you never can have a homogeneous actor because in society you have all of these divisions. But they act under the pretense that the people is one. Now, both share charismatic leadership, but the way in which charismatic, and by charisma I don't mean something that you just have it because you are cute or you are handsome or whatever. It's a social creation, right? The people have to see a leader as out of the extraordinary, and the leader has to control herself or himself as out of the extraordinary. But the way in which they prove their charisma is in the case of fascism, the leader is the embodiment of the people. They do not need elections because the leader's power is recognized in all of these ceremonies of mass assent. I mean, the moment in which all of these crowds cheer a particular leader, that is seen to be more democratic than elections because elections distort popular will. In populism, you still need elections. That's why I say that power is semi-embodied, because the leaders consider themselves and their followers consider themselves to be the embodiment of the real people. However, he or she has to win elections, and you can always lose elections. And so power is not embodied, it's semi-embodied. And that brings to the legitimacy. I mean, in fascism, they abolish elections, they replace elections with ceremonies of mass assent, and they have totalitarian aspirations. The idea is for the state to swallow the private sphere in civil society. In populism, elections are the only mechanism elections are the only way to get to power legitimately. And in Latin America and in other parts, the first incorporation of people previously excluded was through populism, and they fought against electoral fraud and against voter restrictions. So elections are very important. But because the leader has to win elections, there is always a temptation to restrict all of these freedoms to make it very difficult for the opposition to win. But in any case, you still have to go and vote, and you can always lose those elections. The notion of the enemy is also very different. The enemy of fascism are total enemies that need to be eliminated because they are polluting, they are destroying the integrity of the nation, the integrity of the family, etc., etc. The populism of, sorry, the enemies of populism do not need to be physically eliminated. Rather, what they use is rhetoric and symbolic attacks to the enemy. Of course, when they use those attacks against the enemy, I mean, of course, it's not as bad as if they kill you, but in any way, it is extremely problematic if you are the target of those attacks. And finally, the notion of historicity. When these movements or these regimes came about, whereas populism have emerged in societies at different levels of modernization, development, more or less institutionalized political systems, you have right and left populism. Fascism emerged a particular period in time, in the interwar period, after violence was normalized, after death was normalized after the First World War, in which the radical right and the radical left praised dictatorship against parliamentarism. Lenin and Carl Schmitt wrote books that were important books against parliamentarism, advocating for dictatorship. And the elites used fascist paramilitary groups to stop the left. I mean, the fear of another Bolshevik revolution was very present in Italy and in Germany. And the idea is that the right could use these paramilitary groups to stop and to repress the left. And of course, we have an utopia to create a new man, a new civilization. Something that, yeah, so in general, and I am sweating. I don't know if it's because it's hot or because I am talking, but anyways, in general, what you have is a debate on whether or not we're talking about two distinct political and social animals, which is the position of Urguela, because he's a positivist, and positivist scholars believe that what you have to have is a very clear distinction between a concept and its other. So populism, I mean, fascism is very different from populism. And they are very afraid of having this idea, I mean, this idea of the cat dog. Sartori's idea that you really have to differentiate a cat from a dog. You cannot have a cat dog. So for Guerra, the main difference from populism and fascism is that populists are pragmatic, they are not ideological. He argues that, you know, anything goes. I am not totally certain that I agree with him, but compared to the Nazis, they appear to be more pragmatic and less ideological zealots. Especially, I think that the main distinction is the use of paramilitary violence. I mean, fascist parties were paramilitary parties, and the idea on whether or not they abolish elections or not. And the goal, right, the goal of fascism was to create a new civilization, a new man in which the state will devour civil society and the private sphere. You don't have that with populism. A very distinct approach is from Federico Finkelstein. He is an historian of populism, of transnational populism, transnational fascism, and also fascism and populism in Latin America and in Europe. And what he argues is that after the defeat of the Axis, it was very difficult for former fascists to continue to be fascists. So Perón and Vargas renounced fascism, meaning that they accepted elections, and they renounced to use violence. I mean, violence against the enemies, to destroy the enemies, and created a new ism that he calls populism. So, whereas fascism muted to populism after the defeat of the Axis, nowadays he said that perhaps radical right populism could mute or could become a different type of fascism. So he has this very interesting volume, The Wannabe Fascists, which is also translated to Spanish and Portuguese. I don't know if it's translated to German, not yet, I guess. But he says that they have not had the will to become fascist, or they have not been allowed, because we live in a different moment in time in which, you know, it's very difficult to become a full-fledged fascist. So they are wannabe fascists, please. if Finkelstein hypothesis is right, what we have to have is the creation of total enemies. The idea of the total enemy is the idea of these groups of people that are polluting, that are destroying, that are destroying the nation, that are destroying the family, that are destroying our ways of living. So I think that Trump has inherited and has developed three types of total enemies. The first one are non-white immigrants of colonial origin, and the idea is that they are destroying the essence, the fabric of the nation, and that they have to be, they come with different cultures, religions, race, and they are destroying the racial purity of the nation, and they have to be marginalized. First, they have to be targeted, recognized, marginalized, detained, expelled, and I don't know what else, right? So Trump is really fulfilling his promise of getting rid of the United States of illegal aliens. The idea is that the idea of illegal alien is becoming a very elastic category, because it's not only people that have entered the United States illegally, it's anybody who has a dark skin color, a brown color, looks like Latino, or speaks Spanish in the streets, and or gives the impression to authorities that it's a possible illegal alien. So ICE is stopping US citizens and arresting them and all of that because they look like illegal aliens. It's a racialization of Latino immigrants, but not only of Latino immigrants, also of Haitians and African immigrants. The second enemy is the promoters of gender ideology. This category was created by the Catholic Church, but not only by the Catholic Church, also by fundamental Christian groups and Pentecostals. And the idea is that these people are destroying the family, the nuclear heterosexual patriarchal family, which is the nucleus, is the cell of society. So you have to protect the family, which after all is the basis of society, from all of these people that are attempting to destroy the family. So under gender ideology, you can put a bunch of people there together, right? People who are struggling for reproductive rights, who are struggling for non-binary identities, people who are looking for, who are demanding gay marriage, etc., etc. And the third one, and this is the more perplexing one, is communism. Differently from 1920s and 30s, where you have a communist trade. I mean, after all, there were rebellions of communists all over the place. In Italy, you have the taking over of factories and of lands promoted by the Communist Party, etc. Nowadays, communism, there are no communists, but still the idea is that cultural Marxism, or the lunatic left, as Trump say, are the enemies. And the way in which they are articulated is, first of all, saying we have to defend, we have to have freedom from establishment. The state cannot control the economy because that goes against individual creativity, individual freedom. So we have to be free from the state. Millet is a very good example of that, but it's also Trump, right? The idea that you don't need to be limited by the state. The second is freedom from woke restrictions of political speech. The idea is that white heterosexual privileged men have been restricted the freedom of speech because they cannot say what they feel, because they cannot be homophobic, they cannot be, they cannot be racist in the public sphere. So the idea is that you have to be free from all of this censorship, of political correctness, reverse discrimination. And also, there is a whole idea of liberating students from liberal professors that are brainwashing. So it's a whole attack on universities that because we are destroying the youth. Yes. So the first conclusion that we have, it's an academic conclusion to my talk, that you have different moments in history of fascism of the 1920s and 30s, the radical right, populism of the 21st century. They have different crises of democracy. Nowadays, they are not praising dictatorship, at least yet. But remember that the United States stopped promoting human rights and democracy at home or abroad, but they have not been praising dictatorship, or at least yet. The second is the image of the total enemy, of course, has changed from the Jew as an abstraction. As historian Enzo Traverso said, the Jew was considered to be the destroyer of Western civilization, of Western culture, and that has muted to, and of course it was not only the Jew, but also Bolshevism, rationalized others, sexual perverts were the enemies of fascism. And nowadays, the total enemy that I say, with the immigrant, as the immigrants say, that ideology, communists, and also gang members that are considered to be terrorists. Nowadays, Trump is attacking boats in the Pacific and in the Caribbean because they are bringing drugs to the United States. Political elites invited fascism to office. Remember that Hitler and Mussolini did not win elections. They did not give coup d'etats. They were invited by elites to be part of coalition governments. And these elites thought that they could control these newcomers. Of course, they were eaten up by these newcomers that pacted with them because they never attacked their economic privileges. But anyway, nowadays, political elites have been normalized in the radical right. The Republican Party allowed Trump to take over. The Republican elites allowed Trump to take over their party. In Argentina, the traditional right accepted an alliance with Milei. And finally, whereas you have violence and paramilitarism in the 1920s and 30s, now you have violence, but you don't have a paramilitary party. But I don't know to what extent ICE is a paramilitary group or not. What do I mean by that? ICE, they do not wear uniforms, they do not show their faces, and they go and grab people, put them in unmarked cars, and they put them in detention centers where people, you don't know if they have been detained, they have not been charged. So I don't know to what extent they are acting, even though they are not a paramilitary group, they are acting as a paramilitary organization. And then the conclusion that is not conclusive, because, I think that we are in a very complicated time, and I agree with authors that say that the concept of populism normalizes right-wing extremists. Mamone, an Italian historian, has very strong arguments saying that you have to stop using the idea of radical right populism. First of all, because some of these radical right populists have fascist origins, and because nowadays radical right populists are part of the normal political scenario in Europe and in other parts. So he proposes to use the concept of fascism or post-fascism. But the problem if you use fascism is that you overstretch a concept that is in itself complicated. So we are in that complicated moment in which, one concept sanitizes and normalizes the radical right, and the other is an overstretching of a concept. What I think that we are is that and I don't know whether or not they are fascists or they have authoritarian aspirations. So Trump learned from his mistakes in the past. The first thing that he did was to attack the deep state, to attack bureaucrats that have loyalty to their position and not to a politician, including the military. He replaced many military people with people that are very supportive of him. And he has the support of the Heritage Foundation. If you look at the report, Trump is following what they wrote about. So it's not that the first Trump only had Bannon. And Steve Bannon, he's not a great intellectual. He thinks of himself as a great intellectual, but he's not. But now he has the Heritage Foundation behind him, and he has the support of tech oligarchs. Differently from the first moment in which technology could grow at the margins of the state, now artificial intelligence and other forms of the new technology, they need to control the state. Violence is becoming normalized against an expanding category of total enemies. They started with the weakest and more vulnerable populations, transsexuals and illegal immigrants. Of course, the category of illegal immigrants is becoming bigger and bigger, but it's now total enemies are becoming liberals, are becoming the lunatic left, etc., etc. And there is a normalization of violence and militarism in the United States, something that I never saw. Of course, There were other periods in history where you have the police and the military presence in the United States, but personally, I have never seen that. And they are becoming part of the normal landscape, I guess. And people are used or becoming used to that. Now, what are the obstacles? I think that Trump is putting the military in a very difficult position. At some point, they will have to decide whether or not they have to follow all of his orders or have to resist, which is very problematic the moment in which civilians ask the military to be the ones who define what democracy is or not. And then he's facing a series of obstacles, right? Federalism is a very good obstacle. If you live in California, you live in a different United States than if you live in Florida, like I do. Then you have the courts of justice. Of course, the Supreme Court is taken over by Trump loyalists. And you also have the political opposition. Polarization itself is an obstacle because Trump has a support of 30–40% of the population, but not everybody is for Trump. And then it's especially, I think, that the main opposition against comes from civil society. And civil society shows the plurality of the population, vis-a-vis the idea of the people as one, or that only a section of the population represents the real people. And I think that's where I start to be a bit more optimistic with all of the massive demonstrations that we have had in the United States not too long ago, a few months ago, I think it was, or perhaps less than a month. And when you have protests of civil society, you influence politicians and influence judges. But I don't know, I think that the elections of 2026 are going to show us whether or not the United States is only a competitive authoritarian regime, meaning a regime in which you have elections, but elections are very difficult for the opposition to win, and the person who's in power has all of the advantages to win. Trump is doing gerrymandering. He's attacking. He's going to make it more and more difficult for liberals to be able to go and vote, for minorities to go and vote. So that under the best scenarios, 2026 will show us that the United States ceased to be a liberal democracy and is a competitive authoritarian regime like Hungary is now a competitive authoritarian regime, or Trump could declare a national emergency. He could use Venezuela as an example. There could be perhaps, if elections are not clean and people go out and protest, he can say that you have insurrections. So I don't know what's going to happen. But on the other, let me finish with this. We're in a very complicated moment in which our certainties are pulling down. I am not very comfortable calling Trump a radical right populist because he has these authoritarian intentions. At the same time, I do not feel right to use the word fascism. Other scholars use the word post-fascism. Enzo Traverso, the Italian historian, has this very great book on post-fascism. Or Pinchestein used the word wannabe fascist. Or perhaps we will need a new category to understand these new forms of authoritarianism. So I am more than open to criticism, debates, challenges, and thanks for your patience. And I hope I didn't talk too fast. If I talk too fast, it's Esteban's fault because he gets too much coffee.
Carlos, thank you. It's fascinating and full of interesting things. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I'd like to exploit my position as moderator to ask the first one, which is just a trivial one. So your reference points for fascism is the 20s and 30s in Europe. But what about the 60s and 70s in the Americas and in Greece and in Spain, in Portugal? Why not more recent forms of fascism as a reference point for what is happening now? Because these were very much in our recent memory in some places.
Because they were dictatorships, right? The ones that you're talking about, the dictatorships. I mean, the relationship between populism and fascism has always been present in the debates in Latin America. Gino Germani, the first series of populism, made his lifelong career to see the similarities and differences between fascism and populism. And then later on, when in the 70s we have the military dictatorship in Chile, in Argentina, the debate in Brazil, the debates on fascism came back. But the thing is that these were military dictatorships. They did not mobilize the population. And so the consensus was that they were not fascist. Now, when you talk about fascism or populism, that's always a complicated thing, right? I was taking the 1920s and 30s as a context because that has been what many scholars are referring back to the 20s and 30s to see the difference and similarities from what is happening now to what happened at that time. But it's a good point that I will take it into consideration. Please.
So as an American, I find myself having a lot of discussions with people about this very topic, and when we're talking about numbers and voters in the United States. People have a misconception because what I consistently get is, well, half of your population voted for this president. The reality is that 77 million votes were cast for Trump, which was about 63% of the population, and just under 50% of the votes cast, right? Given your definition of populism and emphasizing electoral legitimacy and the construction of the people, how should we interpret these claims that half of Americans voted for Trump? And how does that substantial absenteeism and uneven voter turnout complicate our understanding of Trump's populist support?
It's a very good point because the United States has never been a perfect democracy. It's a very complicated democracy. Up until the 1960s, it excluded African Americans in the South from voting. And nowadays, with the Electoral College, it gives priority to rural areas that are more conservative. So you're perfectly right. Trump never had a mandate, a popular mandate. But nonetheless, according to the institutional rules of the game, he won the election. And he won the election. Now, how can he? I mean, populists have this tendency of considering themselves to be not the embodiment, to have a mission to save the people, to rescue the people, to create something new, because they consider that whatever is existing now is in total chaos, is in total misery. You have to do something new. And that's what Trump thinks that he's doing. But you're perfectly right. His weakness is that most Americans, especially Americans in larger cities, didn't vote for Trump. And that's a big, and he knows that. That's why he's going to try to make everything possible to further disempower people who tend to vote for Democrats in order to win, if he's able to win the 2026 midterm election. But that's true. I mean, Trump never has had the support of 50% of the population. The problem is, and this is where I have discussions with my sons. They didn't want to get out and vote last time for Kamala because she's too conservative, blah, 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 blah. I said, you have to go and vote. I mean, there's no way out. If you don't vote, you don't eat. So finally they went out to vote, but the problem with many young people is that they did not have too much of an incentive to vote for such a mainstream candidate. Well, things are changing, and I don't know what to say, but I mean, Van Damme's election in New York, all of the wins of the Democratic Party were great. However, the leadership of the party bent to Trump and accepted, the Senate accepted to reopen again the United States, giving up their demands for defending healthcare and Obamacare.
Well, it was 8 specific senators, so it's problematic that they actually went against the party and their own best interests, right? Not recognizing what it's going to do to healthcare, what it's going to do to things like public benefits. And again, there's this misconception that half of the budget and the American budget is spent on social programming, when that's not true. It's in the military industrial complex that we spend most of our money. And look at all the money that's been poured into ICE. So what are they if not a Gestapo, correct? I mean, we have them not, the idea was that they were going to be arresting the worst of the worst. And they're grabbing anybody who's brown or black or speaks Spanish. So it's so problematic. And I think that there's just, the media is complicit in this. There is such a skewed view as to what is actually happening in the country and what people see on this side of the ocean, which is extremely frustrating, because it's like you're attacking trans people who are 0.03% of the population and making it seem like they are the biggest problem, that brown and black bodies are the biggest problem. And it's incredibly, it's in every class that I'm taking here, Trump is brought up in every class. It almost feels like an attack. And it's like, you know, most Americans don't agree with these policies. They don't agree with what he's doing, but it's hard not to take it personal as someone who firmly believes in democracy and firmly believes in the potential of my country. And yet Trumpism is taking over this view where people are like, well, you know, your people voted for that.
Yeah, and going back to your first comment, I mean, what Trump has been doing is demonizing and inventing these total enemies, looking at the most vulnerable sectors of the population. And unfortunately, he has been able to do that. And the thing is that this notion of the total enemy is becoming more expansive. And people are naturalizing and are normalizing all of these attacks to the human rights of the other, whatever the other is, instead of thinking that it could happen to themselves. And that's what is really, but not everybody. If you look at the demonstrations of the No Kings demonstration, less than a month ago, those were massive, those were huge. And now, how can you translate that to votes?
But again, and look at what he did with
We have
that.
3 more questions.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, he literally made an AI video pooping on those people.
Oh, yes.
Just a brief follow-up question for Russ' question is, I think, well, obviously, there is a comparative approach at the basis of these categorizations, and I think at this moment of time it makes perfect sense to look back at history and see how the Nazis came to power, or Mussolini came to power. Well, in Spain it's a bit different, but because we had this coup first, but I think that Spain is a good example for fascism outlasting any of the other fascist movements. So, but there is obviously peril there, because things have changed, and it is difficult not to see how the novelty of the impact that media have at this moment on the way truth is conceived of. So I think, well, shouldn't we not go deeper into these infrastructural and mediatic phenomena to understand that what is being done at this moment, or what is being prepared for, is completely novel?
That's a very good point, and I agree with you. I think that what is happening now is that we have informational niches. You only look at information according to your political preferences. So the right in the United States watches Fox News, and then you get news from social media. So the whole idea of truth that we used to have until not too long ago. Of course, it was never a total truth or a truth with a capital T, but at least you have certain networks or certain newspapers that you will read, and that will be what is happening. Nowadays, we cannot even agree on what is happening because you have all of these niches of information. So in those niches of information, it's much more easy to use all of these lies, right? And all of these conspiracy theories and all of these things that the radical populist right is using now, or if you want to call it the one of the fascists are using now. So I think that you are right. I mean, the talk that I gave was with very long brushes, comparative brushes of the 1920s and 30s with what is happening now. But if you want to go much more in detail, you have to look at several aspects of this. And what I didn't talk today, and I will remember to do it again if I did this talk, is to make a distinction between both, which is what Paxton does in his work on fascism, and what I have done in my work on populism. These movements are not the same when they are challenging the power of elites and they are out of power. It's not the same when they, of course, this is more about populism than fascism, when they get elected and win one power of the state, one all of powers of the state, and then when they become a regime. So you have to look at developmental history of these movements, and of course you have to look at the media, you have to look at discourses, you have to look at the mechanisms of diffusion.
Thank you very much for this historical imperative approach. I was wondering a little bit more about the current situation on two levels. So formal politics and informal politics. And this is for inside the US, because I was struggling with the term, this is not paramilitary, when we see images on how migration officers violently pull out people, like drag out people. And this is organized. So that is one point, and how the formal and informal connections between regimes or between governments inside the Americas, but also with the outer right in Germany look like. Do you have information on that, or how does this play out like on a formal and informal level?
Well, what is fascinating is that, I mean, it's not fascinating. Populists have, I mean, all of these movements have always been transnational. And so the levels of the center of diffusion of radical right populism now is Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. is influencing other parts of the world. You can see that with Brazil. I mean, the Brazilians copycat the insurrection of January from the American example. Bannon was giving them lectures and telling them how to do, to get to power and stay in power and how to govern. So the centers of diffusion are there. In the case of radical right populism for Latin America, it's not only Washington, D.C., it's also Vox in Spain with this Ibersphere. This idea that you have to have this sphere of influence for the Iberian Peninsula, for the Iberian-speaking people that Vox wants to do. And then in terms of normal life in the United States, it's very complicated because, they are all of this level of violence. I mean, I don't know how to interpret ICE. Sometimes I think of them as what the Argentinian military used to do to kidnap people and to kidnap terrorists and subversives. They call them subversives, right? They will come in the middle of the night or at whatever point in time, put you in a car and disappear you. ICE is doing something very similar. And what the Argentinian military did was they were part of the Navy, of the Air Forces, or the Army. And ICE is also is this organization, but they have the support of other organizations of the armed forces. So I don't know to what extent it will be a very interesting research to see what ICE is and how they are becoming normalized. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Okay. You said in your response here, what the last thing was about the people living in the US now, seeing others as those in targets, not feeling themselves in the target. And as a German, having grown up in the 80s and being taught not to repeat fascism this was the main thing. If others get under pressure, don't think that you will not get under pressure at some time. Try to be an ally. And then I was thinking about the outside thing and what I see with the anti-immigrant thing in the States and here in Germany with the anti-refugee thing. It's like in the moment that the power of the state has changed. Like Russians don't have a legal right to be refugees anymore. Afghans don't have a legal right to be refugees anymore. If there would be, it's like a public idea that you share the politics of this state, which is one of the important factors again in pressing people in certain roles and not being an ally. Do you understand? I'm not sure.
What I will say about your
clear.
comment is that in the United States, I am a professor in Florida, and in Florida, academic freedom has been under attack before Trump get to power, because we have Governor DeSantis who wants to be to the right of Trump. That is possible, but he has always been trying to do that. So there has been all of these attacks to academic freedom, but many white Americans do not know how to deal with attacks to academic freedom, attacks to freedoms in general, because they have never experienced a dictatorship. Whereas us, immigrants from Latin America and other countries where we have seen authoritarianism, we are more able to do that. And when I talk about Americans, I'm talking about white Americans, because African Americans have lived under apartheid for such a long period of time that they know how to deal and how to deal with the repressive situations. So that for me is very worrisome about the United States. The fact that that's a divide and rule strategy that Trump is following. He attacks one university, but universities have difficulty of coordinating a defense as a group. Same thing with law offices. It's like different law offices have difficulties of having collective action. And so the idea is that if you keep your head down, if you don't open your mouth, perhaps this will disappear. And even if you just read history, you should know that that's the wrong answer, but it's not everybody, right? There has been lots of take back from churches, the Catholic Church somehow, or at least some sectors of the Catholic Church defending immigrants, but it's not massive yet because there is fear. And the fear that you see in the United States, for me, shows that the United States is no longer a democracy. You can call it a competitive authoritarian state because elections will continue to take place, but under a very skewed electoral field, which will be very difficult for Democrats to win. And I'm not saying that. That's something that Steve Levitsky, this political scientist at Berkeley, said. Not at Berkeley, at Harvard. I gave him the...
I think she was good for me, right?
Valeria, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask you if maybe you are familiar with Saya Valencia idea of fascism 2.0. She's a feminist, and she says that in our contemporary world, the authoritarianism operates through Facebook, Instagram, a lot of media and mass media communications. And I don't know if maybe when you were talking about all these tech oligarchs that are part of this renewed fascism, how do you think that maybe this virtuality is changing or reshaping our relationships or the embodied experience, political experience?
Still, I don't know because I have not read that, and I would really appreciate if you can give me the reference. Sorry.
Question at the back, and then we have a couple of questions in the online chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Carlos, for this really interesting talk. I'm also curious about the comparison that you started out with, right? You laid out the similarities in the start of all of this between especially Brazil and the US, or Latin America and the US, and then in the end, Latin American cases fell out a little bit. And I'm curious about, especially when you talk about obstacles, I'm interested in responses to the far right. And you said obstacles in the US that give you some sort of hope, or the federal system, civil society. What about Latin America? What gives you hope there? What works in responding to the far right? And of course, we know Bolsonaro was put into jail, and it's not something that Trump is facing at the moment.
No, that's a very good point, and I will use it for if I present this again, because that's a way of bringing back Brazil, because I just mentioned it, right? Bolsonaro was charged of trying to give a coup d'etat, and the system of justice work in Brazil, whereas in the United States it didn't work. They will be very interesting to go all of these strategies that work in Brazil, which was not only the judiciary, it was civil society, the judiciary, political opposition, etc., and to show, because that also goes against this idea that everything that happens in Latin America is backward, anti-democratic, proto-totalitarian, or authoritarian, whereas the United States is the beacon of democracy. So that would be a very nice way of linking together the two aspects of it. To try to, I'm not trying to defend, to excuse myself, but the thing is that because I live in the United States, I am obsessed. Sorry, I have this compulsive, obsessive personality. That's what I think that you need to become a professor, right? You have to be totally obsessed about things. And so I'm obsessing about Trump. Sometimes I have insomnia and say, De La Torre, don't be so crazy. What do you think about Trump at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Questions from the chat?
So I'm reading out loud for the room, continuing on the Brazil theme. So it's a question from Roberto Rovalino. Thank you, Carlos, for your talk and insights to a very complex political scenario. My name is Roberto, and I am speaking from Brazil. I would like to ask about the aesthetic dimensions of Trump's second office. It seems to me that there is the circulation of a fascist sensible order, a group of images produced by the state that normalize and project a violence yet to come. Two cases are exemplary of this: the videos of Immigration Secretary visiting and praising the architecture of El Salvador prisons, and the videos of the executions made by the US in the Caribbean. It seems that there is a policy of normalizing these actions and a praise to these aesthetics of the inhuman prison and the executions. Have you any thoughts on this?
No, I totally agree. It's a very good point. I mean, the moment in which you have these videos that are supposed to calm you down of immigrants rattling their chains, because it sounds like, what you were saying, Trump throwing human excrement on people demonstrating against him. I mean, the level of the humanization against the other, it's almost fascist. But yeah, it's a very good point. Okay.
Well, thank you. I found it very interesting. And I was it got stuck in my head, the idea that somehow fascism was a thing 100 years ago, and then somehow the context didn't allow politicians to be fascist anymore, so they became populist. That was kind of the idea that I got somehow. And now they can be like out of the closet again and be this fascist force again. I kind of felt it that way. And I would like to ask you at the end, what's your conclusion? What's the best word you got to describe Trump? What's the ism that you like the most, or you find less problematic with him?
Well, it's Federico Finkelstein's idea, right? His idea is the moment in which, because General Perón, Juan Perón, he was an admirer of Mussolini. He lived in Italy. And when Mussolini died, a journalist asked him, should we erect a monument for him or name a street of him? And this leader said, Perón said, one in every street. I mean, he loved the guy. But he knew that, according to Finkelstein, this is not my idea, it's Finkelstein's idea, that when the Nazis lost the war, you needed to have elections. So the way in which former fascists adapted to democratic times is by creating a new ism that he calls populism. Of course, this is a wrong argument in general because not all populists have fascist origins. That applies very well to Perón. It applies very well perhaps to Vargas too.
Exactly.
But that's it. I mean, others do not really have these fascist origins. But anyways, I think it's an interesting idea because of his other book, The Wannabe Fascist, when he says, as fascism moved to populism, now we might be in a different historical moment in which radical right populism, not all populism, radical right populism could become fascism, and they are wannabe fascists. It's an intriguing argument, it's a very creative argument, but I'm still a social scientist, and even though I am not a follower of Sartori and want to totally distinguish a dog from a cat, I still believe that you need concepts that allow you to make sense of these complicated moments. So I think that I agree with the criticisms that the concept of radical right populism normalizes and sanitizes radical right groups, radical right populist groups. But I also think that the concept of fascism is overstretched if you want to talk about it. So of course, what the scholars always do is to talk about post-fascism or neo-fascism, but still the problem is there. So to tell you the truth, I don't know. I wish I knew and I would be rich and famous. Because I think that it's very interesting because I am very inspired by Germani, not because I really like him, but because what he did. Germani was this Italian guy who was an anti-fascist. He was arrested by Mussolini, and then Germani's mother got him and put him in Argentina. And he became one of the first sociologists in Argentina who created sociology in Argentina. He lost his position when Perón got to power. But all of the contemporaries, the left, intellectuals, most people argued that Perón was a fascist. And what Germani said, come on, he's not a fascist. He's similar to fascism, but he's different. So perhaps we're in a moment in which we need to have new categories to try to understand these convoluted times. But I am not like Germani. I don't know what category to invent, or perhaps to use post-fascism, following Enzo Traverso, who's this very intelligent Italian Marxist historian. So sorry I couldn't answer you.
When there was the question about aesthetics, on Martin Luther King, Jr. King Day, when there was like this official part, and then there was this more intimate part of the Trump taking office, and that had a very fascist aesthetic. It is red drapes everywhere, and I was looking at this thing on the screen and I couldn't look at it for a long time because the aesthetics was very much like a Nazi.
Yeah, and then you see Steve Bannon and you see Musk raising, doing the fascist salute. So, I mean, I think that the symbols of fascism are coming back, and they are being normalized again. I mean, they are normalizing all of those hate symbols that were out of the public. Of course, they never disappear, but you cannot be open about that because you look like a total jerk. But now you look like you are a normal human being. And it's very interesting because it has also been going through video games, especially for young men who are alone and lonely. I mean, there's all of these things that fascist aesthetics and ideas have been circulating. Of course, Trump did not create all of this. He's the product of a very polarized society, but he's thriving on polarization. And the end result is unknown.
I think we need to slowly start to look at what we were going to. Can I ask one question to sort of wind up and maybe you said that you bring a stock of experience with you, which the middle class liberal white American class doesn't have and lacks. What do they need to learn from those who have these experiences? what would they need to do to catch up?
It's a very good question. It's very complicated because, see, I was the director of the Center for Latin American Studies. I was hired in Florida to do that. And when I was hired, they asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to make the center look more like Latin America. What do you mean by that? Make it look more Black, more brown, more poor, more indigenous. So at that time, equity, diversity, and inclusion were not forbidden words. Later on, they became forbidden words that we cannot use money for those type of programs. And so after Trump won the election, the provost asked me to step down from the directorship of Latin American Studies. They didn't kick me out. I have tenure, so I'm part of the furniture, I guess. But but I was removed from this position of leadership. What I told my faculty, or the faculty of the center, that was very difficult for some white Americans faculty to understand, is that in Latin America we have this saying. I pretend to follow the rules, but I do not really follow the rules. If a law or a rule is totally normatively wrong, you pretend to follow that because you don't want to. Sometimes you have to pick up fights that are more complicated. But you just pretend to follow and then you continue to do whatever you have been doing. So at the center, people work on things that are not necessarily priorities of this administration. From climate change to intersectionality, racism, whatever. We talk about Latin America, not the United States, but always it's comparative. So I think it's to learn to live in these uncertain times, which is very complicated, and to create senses of solidarity. I think that, for instance, in Gainesville, which is a small town in northern Florida, going to the demonstrations against Trump, I go not only because I have to make my voice heard, but more than anything is also because you feel as part of a community that is not longer supporting all of these horrible things. It's different when you're in Chicago, New York, when you're in a big city, you're part of this huge demonstration. But you are in the middle of nowhere, like where I live, where most people outside of Gainesville are Trump followers. It's very important to feel that you are part of a community of resistance. So I don't know if I answered your question. I tried.
Is there one last question?
One last question.
Keep it very short, please.
I'm just curious on your thoughts, because the Heritage Foundation is so active in this administration, on the upcoming projects that they have, which is Project Esther, Project Phoenix, as well as their education and faith-based initiatives. Do you know about any of those?
I don't know any of them. We have to learn more about it.
Yeah, there's a couple more coming up that they've got.
Well, it's very scary because, see, the first Trump didn't know he knew what he was doing. He promised to do certain things and he did those things. But there was no an intellectual project behind that. Now you have. Now, so.
Thank you for your time, by the way.
Thank you for a fascinating talk and one that I think also resonates with us here for a long way. The States are not years away. Thank you for the questions, for the answers, for the discussion. Hope we can have you here more often.
Thanks so much for having me here. This was great. Thanks for the questions and the comments and your patience.